Hello and welcome to Missionary Ramblings podcast. I'm Steve Hendrix, your host, and my guest today is Jeff Campbell with Novo Ministries, and he is currently in Spain joining us today. Hello, Jeff.
Hi, Steve. Nice to be with you.
Thank you, sir. Just can you give us a quick bio of what you do and why you do it?
I'm Jeff Campbell. I have been on the mission field for 35 years. 1986 had me coming to Germany with an itinerant music group working with American military kids overseas. I have gravitated. I did youth ministry, adult ministry, executive leadership, and finally have found probably what feels like my sweet spot in pastoral care or missionary care, depending on what organization you're from. So I'm a counselor to missionaries, a pastor to missionaries, a spiritual director to missionaries. My wife and I do that in Spain through Novo. We've served 30 plus years with Cadence International. So we're relative newcomers to Novo. The first 30 plus years of our ministry were working with American military folks, largely in Europe, but really around the world. And most of that was in some kind of support or leadership of the missionaries that were actually reaching out to servicemen and their families. So we've only been in Spain for about 2 months. So all of the cultural transition that you hear me talk about is biographical right now. But my wife and I live here. We've got 4 kids, all adulting, 26, 24, 22, and 20. And the next generation of Campbells will start somewhere around the middle of July when I get a grandson born to Jacob, my oldest, and his wife, Laura, which we're crazy excited about. So that's kind of what we do. Candy and I serve on a team in Malaga, Spain. That team is about 14 people, and we call it a holistic member care model, where we've got a psychologist, we've got some coaches, we've got spiritual directors, we've got licensed counselors, we've got folks that specialize in trauma and marriage, we've got a third culture kid expert. And so we try to create an environment here where we can provide a holistic environment for care in a community model. We really want love to be the lattice work that connects us, and we invite people into care about 50% of the time, and we go out to care about 50% of the time. We do 4 or 5 retreats a year to try to help missionaries cultivate the skills to continue thriving. And some of that is in categories of debriefing, self-care kind of things. And then some of that is helping them figure out what it means to access the power of the Spirit in their particular context, or deal with particular crisis. So there's the crisis side of things, and then there's the development side of things. And we really like leaning into both. Part of the job of missionary care is helping sick people get well. And then there's a whole nother part of it is helping well people become fit. And both of those are really important to having a thriving missionary.
Excellent. Thank you. I think it's worth noting too, you talked about your wife and your kids, but your entire family life has been surrounded in mission work because you met your wife while you were doing mission work, and all 4 of your kids grew up participating in your family's ministry work.
We really did. It was important for us to engage ministry as a family calling. Mm-hmm. And so certainly, if you had my kids on the podcast with you, they would tell you stories where they have wounds and stories that they have incredible blessings, like anybody does in any environment. But they did grow up in a ministry home.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. So before we really get started on the conversation, as most people know, I like to start us off with a prayer to just ask for God's blessing on our conversation here. So let's do that. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for all the opportunities you give us to discuss the work we have to do in your will and the chances we have to build friendships and to have conversations with other-minded people who believe in participating in your will and doing your work. And I thank you for the years you have blessed me with the friendship with Jeff and his family. In fact, I've gotten to go over when they were in Germany and visit with them. It was a great blessing to me. And so I just thank you for all those opportunities personally. But I also lift up our conversation today because it's an important topic about missionary care and missionary lives being as fruitful and as well cared for as those they're trying to help. And so just lift up this conversation to you, Lord, that you bless it. And we do all this in your name of your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So let's start, I guess, with a big question, kind of why do you do what you do? But you've got this ministry where you're working with missionaries who are in the field in different parts of the world. You're actually not just dealing with people in Spain, if I remember correctly. You're dealing with people all over the world who have different experiences, but different cultural strains, different marital strains, different strains altogether, just based on where they're at. So, just kind of what is important about missionary care that has drawn you to it?
Yeah, great question, Steve. We also work with not just Novo people. About 40% of folks that we work with are from other organizations that may not have as robust a representation, or a care option. They're somewhat limited in the way they can pursue or be cared for, and so we have the opportunity to reach cross-organizationally, which is great. I said earlier, just a few minutes ago, that I started as a young 23-year-old doing itinerant evangelism in and among American military folks living in Germany and Italy and England, wherever there was a military presence in Europe at that point. And that led to running youth groups on military bases, and that led to being a divisional leader of the youth ministry, the worldwide youth ministry for Cadence International. And I had a seat on the exec team, so was a part of the central leadership team for Cadence. And I did that for 12 years, which bumped me up into my early 40s. And I found that probably my primary gift set was not, at least it wasn't administrative organizational leadership. And at that point in my life, I think my understanding of my career path was, if you were good at what you did on the field, you got bumped into regional leadership. If you were good at regional leadership, you got bumped into executive leadership. And it was really a crisis, a vocational crisis at least, when I went, well, what if I'm not wired to run on that traditional Christian leadership track? And I started probing a little bit into my pastoral gifts, my counseling bent. I always cared much more about who someone was than where they were going. I made myself as a leader do the strategic stuff. I made myself be at least competent in helping cast vision, organize resources to mobilize, getting us going toward a vision. But those kind of things never really made my heart beat fast. The thing that made my heart beat fast was bringing people together in community, seeing lives changed by a loving community environment. I had a real passion that someone who was struggling would never have to struggle alone. I didn't want people to be in some of the lower moments of life and feel like they had no resources. Now, if you were to ask the people that were under my leadership, even in those executive years of leadership or those regional years of leadership, they would have said, yeah, Jeff, you led as a pastor and as a counselor, even when you were our leader. But I had a significant kind of a fulcrum or a threshold moment, maybe is best to say, with a friend of mine where we sat down and he was going through something, I don't even remember what, but as we got ready to talk, he said, hey, before we start talking, I need to know, are you my boss? Are you my pastor? Are you my counselor? Are you my friend? What hat are you wearing? Because that's going to impact what I talk to you about and how I posture what I say. And that I think started me thinking that if I'm wearing the leader hat, it does change the way people talk to me about their problems. And I cared much more about authentically having access to their souls than helping them be effective at accomplishing some mission objective. Somewhere in there, that meant I got trained. I did a master's degree in counseling. I did a doctorate in spiritual formation for ministry leaders. And I realized that I cared much more about someone's internal processes than I did about what they were doing outside, functionally moving forward in terms of achieving goals. Probably this is an oversimplification, but in my heart, I felt much more called to them as a human being than a human doing. I kind of believed that if they were the right kind of person connected to God in the right kind of ways, the overflow of that process would result in effective ministry. And then significantly I don't know how deeply we'll get into this, Steve, but just the quick thumbnail is probably 15 years ago. I went 12 years ago. I had a fairly significant depression, and I'm an optimist by nature, but I hit this wall and just could not find. It was partly physical exhaustion, and there were some emotional components to. But I hit this wall, and I didn't know how to find God. I didn't know how to find myself, and I really needed to pursue some member care assistance in finding my way to thrive, my way to find my way back into a healthy posture on the mission field. And it's really tricky to figure out how to write a prayer letter that says, yes, give money to support my ministry, when I don't want to talk to God. I don't want to read my Bible. I'm discouraged. I'm depressed. And I've got all these churches and individuals that I'm representing. And it becomes a real tricky catch-22 of how honest can I be about who I am and what's going on in my life with my support team. So I think that served as something that switched a gear. And about 10 or 12 years ago is when I made the full-on jump into member care, where my job is not what's going on, it's who are you as you do whatever you are doing.
Great, thank you. You mentioned the human being aspect, and I think that's an important idea for us to really tackle today. I don't face it probably nearly as much as some, because most people know that I'm here more as an engineer sometimes than as clergy or anything like that, because I'm not actually clergy. I'm just a lowly engineer. But both their pastors at home and people who go in the mission field, there's an expectation that we're supposed to be better at communicating with God. We're supposed to be better at being holy sometimes, but we're just people. We're just human beings, as you said, and we struggle through the same types of things everybody else does. We have sin in our lives. We have to overcome. We have struggles that we have. Many of the people I know that you deal with sometimes have marital stress that they're going through with, that's caused by cultural context or just the strain of always having to be there for other people and never being able to spend time on themselves. Let's tackle that subject a little bit, about the fact that missionaries really are everyday people. There's nothing different about them really than anybody else, other than the fact that they accepted a call. They were given and accepted a call to go somewhere and do something, because that was just what God needed them to do, or what they needed in their own lives. For me, it was personally what I needed in my own life that got me going overseas in the way for God to fix me. So as you deal with people, you're helping, that context has to be very important, correct?
Yeah, and just sort of summarize what you said, real people with real problems. And I think, for your listeners that might be on the support side of sending missionaries, Oh, it's so important to give the people that you're supporting, praying for, giving toward their ministry, the freedom to be real people with real problems. One of the things that is tossed around in member care circles is that when you go overseas into a cross-cultural environment, cracks become chasms. So a little crack in my character, a little crack in my relationship with my wife, a little crack in something that might just kind of move on business as usual in a monocultural environment can become really, it just can become expanded. It can become much more difficult and become a crisis when you get into a cross-cultural environment. And some people are going, well, what's so different about a cross-cultural environment? In Germany, certainly it was a very Western experience that I was having. But no matter how much I worked on my language, I was probably it was going to take lots of extra energy for me to function in a culture that was not my home culture. So it's as if, picture this, you wake up in the morning and you've got a low-grade fever. Now, you don't feel awful. It's not like you need to stay in bed and go to the doctor. None of that stuff is true, but you have this low-grade fever. You just don't feel quite right. That's every day for most folks operating in another culture. They just have a little bit less capacity than they would in their home culture. They always have that low-grade fever, a little bit of headache, a little bit of scratchy throat, not enough to totally stop them in their tracks. But they live with the pressure of not quite fitting. It can be little things like I go to fill out a form, and I'm not quite sure when it says puts an address down. Do they want the address that I'm living in that culture, my permanent address back in the United States, my kids going to college? It was such a crisis when they went to fill out college applications, figuring out what's the address to put in any given box, because we don't fit the boxes. And if you put the wrong answer in the wrong box, all of a sudden you're in a whole different, the binary path, you're down the wrong track, and you're showing up with all the Chinese students that don't speak English for college when college orientation starts. Or you're not entitled to certain scholarships because you put a wrong address in a wrong box, and it really is the right address, but it's not the way they asked the question. It was just hard to figure out what it was that they were asking. So all of those things make a cross-cultural environment a stress environment that really does fan the flames of existing. It doesn't cause problems necessarily. I guess it can cause the problems, but it tends to exacerbate small problems, making them bigger when you get into that environment.
Yeah, I've always struggled with the date phenomenon. The U.S. date is typically the month, day, and year. And overseas, it's typically day, month, year. Well, this isn't a problem until all of a sudden you're working in Excel spreadsheets with people in a different culture who can't get around the head of the fact that Microsoft Excel only wants the American version of the date. They don't have a function for the European style of the date. And so all your dates in every form you get are completely wrong, and you have to go correct them. And yeah, every time I'm coming back to the States, I'm like, okay, am I supposed to fill out month first, date first? Which one is it? Just a little bit of confusion there over even the date.
Well, and that's a great example because it takes some emotional and cognitive bandwidth away from you. Mm-hmm. It's not, anytime you go through a transition, like there are certain things within my home culture, resources, relationships, rhythms, I know how they work. I kind of build my habits and patterns. And I guess if I move from Dallas to Seattle, I've got some transitional time where I've got to learn new rhythms, new resources, new relationships. And that takes energy. Now, add on top of that, a culture that has some written and some unwritten norms and codes that you've got to figure out, language that you are really poor in to start off with, and you keep messing up. No one knows who you are, and there's no way to kind of find your way down to normalizing those rhythms, resources, and relationships, and you're losing emotional bandwidth with each one of those. So your capacity gets really limited. And now you go home after you've been out all day long, you've worked, and you had 7 things on your list of things to do. You got 1 done, and you walk in, and your wife has had the same experience, and 2 of the kids are not enjoying their new schooling experience. One of them feels lonely and wants to head back to the States. And this is the environment you sit down at the table for dinner. And you ask the question, hey, how's everybody doing? And it becomes a much more complicated question. Now, I don't want to oversimplify the reality that family systems are complicated, even if you all live in a monocultural environment. All I want to do is ratchet up that when you add a layer of cross-cultural adjustment and everybody has a low-grade fever, it's easy for those cracks to really become chasms and to have some significant problems, particularly if you don't have an organizational culture that says when you're struggling, that struggle is normal. And so when you're struggling, let's talk about it.
Right.
A lot of our Christian environment is, hey, if you're a good, healthy, Bible-believing Christian, you don't struggle. You're healthy, wealthy, and wise. And that's just nowhere in Scripture. Or you've got to at least be very selective on the verses you pick.
Yeah, I mean, we do struggle, all of us in every regard, and us as missionaries are no different. You touched a little bit about language and the difficulty sometimes there. One of the things I have struggled with is cultural context of language. So I may know the Kiswahili word for an English word, but it may mean something completely different to them than it does here in the U.S. For example, friend. In Tanzania, every person you meet is your friend. They're once you meet them, they are now Rafiki and friend. And in the U.S., typically we don't consider somebody a friend until after we develop some kind of bond. We have found some common ground. We've had some communications. We've done some things together, and we have a certain level of trust that is the basis of that friendship. And that's just not the case in other cultures sometimes. Sometimes it's, that's, you're just friends. There's, ultimately we have all that. It's just all rolled into one. And I find that difficult to navigate sometimes because of the differences in what people call friends and so forth. It's been difficult for me, at least.
Well, and to add to that, like in Germany, you walk down the street and you are met with very stone-faced glares. Now, I come out of my southern roots where, hey, you're walking through the mall. Hey, hi, hey. I mean, the girl at Bojangles who's 19 years old calls me sweetheart, for crying out loud. It's this very, the engagement factor, particularly in the South, is really high. And a German, I started my German experience and said, yeah, Germans are just grumpy. And that's really where I went. They're just so rude. And as I got to know a few Germans, this is how they would describe it. Why would I disrespect friendship by choosing to relate with someone that I don't know as if I do know them? And so a German would see the Southern expression as disingenuous and somehow disrespecting the nature of a real friendship. They go, I speak to the people that I really know and I give them value. And otherwise, I'm just moving on in life. So for them, it's an integrity issue, not a grumpiness issue. Americans, they would say, have a low fence to jump over to become a friend. And then it's actually, to really get deep with an American, there's a high fence in that next level. Germans have a high fence on the outside to let you in. And once you get over that fence, it's much more accessible. Right. But it really is a cultural issue, not and to view it as culture and preference rather than right, wrong, black, white, moral or immoral, that's the trick. Because when you feel like an outsider, it's easy to start to think us and them, and it's very seldom us and them.
So your experience is almost totally the opposite of what I have in the friend regard. But there,
Yeah.
those are not the only ones we have difficulty with, and that's a stress level. Is the fact that I may
Yeah.
learn the language, the word for that, but what their perception of it is completely different from my perception of it.
Yeah, great
And
observation.
I've run into that a lot with like the word professional. The word professional to me is the guy who gets in early, does the extra things that need to be done to make a job run better, to run more profitable, however you want to look at it. And here, professional is the straight up definition of I got paid to do a job, therefore I am a professional, and none of the nuances that we have.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, there are a lot of language barriers, but then there are a lot of cultural language barriers as well.
So it's a great observation. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the net result is that all of it steals. You've got a finite amount of capacity, and those things erode your capacity.
Yeah. As you said, it takes up your bandwidth, takes up the things you have to work with, and puts more stress and strain on you emotionally, mentally, and sometimes even physically.
Yeah,
We talked a
absolutely.
bit about the husband-wife collaboration. I'm sure you've got some folks in the field who are in countries which are, how can I put this nicely, male-dominated, misogynistic, maybe, in the fact that they
Certainly
don't see women
patriarchal.
as competent,
Yeah.
and we're bringing women over from cultures that are competent, know they're competent, and want to be treated as they're competent.
Yeah. Yeah, patriarchal cultures are tricky, and I've got to be careful. I don't have a ton to offer on this. Like, I do some counseling with some folks that are in those patriarchal cultures, but I don't know that I have a ton to offer by way of expertise in that environment. I have tons of respect for women that follow the Lord into those environments, because there is when Paul says, I've become all things to all men, it's a significant sacrifice for those women to become all things and to subject themselves into those cultural stereotypes wherever, so that the gospel can be reflected. I have a friends that served in Afghanistan, actually no, Pakistan, and they were serving a nomadic tribe, doing Bible translation for this tribe. And in the summers, in the winters they would live in a compound in a city. In the summers they would go out and be, they had tents, they rode out on horses, and they would intentionally try to be everything that this nomadic tribe, they wanted their lives to look exactly like this nomadic tribe in terms of resources and relationships, except that Jesus was a part of their world. Because they would typically, these nomadic tribes would say, well, you don't understand, you're not like us, you're a Westerner, you live these ways. They tried to remove all of the barriers. And so all of the women got, in the family, got nose piercings, because if you don't have a nose piercing, you don't belong to a man. And so they got nose piercings. It wasn't just, they dressed like the folks in the tribe, so that when someone, they ate by the dietary laws of the tribe. They didn't drink alcohol because that was taboo. All of those things, they wanted to align themselves with the way this tribe worked, so that when they said, yeah, but you don't understand here, they would say, the only difference between me and you is Jesus. So let's just cut all the other off. Let's push it off the table.
Yeah.
And the woman, the women's role was a significant part of that, and very hard for them at times when they saw, people that they'd grown to love in these tribes, the women of these tribes, not being treated well.
And so I think that's important for people who are supporting missionaries who may be in those type cultures, to consider the fact that they may need a little additional marital support or additional love, simply because of the fact that may be an additional stress involved there. That she may feel unrespected because of those cultural norms or something like that. So that may be creating more strain and stress for her to overcome, and just
Well,
more intention love.
yeah, I would say if you're on a missions committee at a church and you want to do something to really bless your missionaries, is once every 2 or 3 years, pay for a husband and wife to go to a really posh, good, like good food, good location marriage conference, and go, hey, I want you to go polish up that foundation, because I think it's generally true across the missions world that there's extra stress on marriages. And so let's work on them. Let's give them resources. Let's not assume that it's not a poor reflection on who they are as people. We want to give them the freedom to struggle. That's the bottom line. And see struggle as not a negative thing, but as a normal thing.
I think that's great. Yeah, I mean, every marriage, regardless of whether it's in another culture, whether business or missionary wise, is going to face some struggles, and they need to work on it. And so, yeah, if they can send them to somewhere they can just be in their marriage, work on their marriage, be honest about it, without all those stress and strains that are involved in the overseas culture, would be wonderful. And I think that's a wonderful idea.
Well, and just let me insert, someone's listening to this that is not a missionary. And I would say that the idea of investing in your marriage in the same way that you would invest in your retirement is absolutely essential if you want to have a vital marriage. To view struggle as normal, to view conflict as just it's like taking out the garbage. The only time you get in trouble with garbage is if you don't tend to it. You take it out, you deal with it. That's conflict in a marriage. It's part of a healthy relationship. And Candy and I, probably 3 years ago now, we did about 6 months of intense marriage counseling and we're the counselors, but we went and paid someone because we had some things in our life we just kept banging up against. We would hit certain conversations and they would gravitate into the same ruts. And in those ruts, I didn't trust her heart for me and she didn't trust my heart for her. And we needed help. And we went and got it, and it was great. So everybody needs periodic tending of their marriages, not just missionaries. So I just want to put that out as a public service announcement. If you don't tend it, at some point you're just going to become roommates. And the intimacy that God invites us to in marriage won't be there.
Great, great. Well, while we're on that topic, let's just talk about some things that people back home who are mission team or just supporters of missionaries can do to try and help with their mental well-being. It's not always about marriage. I'm a single person who's in the mission field. And so I have my different struggles and things like that. And there are things that people have done for me over the years that have been a great blessing on those lines. The best thing I can say is when people respond, I write a blog on a fairly regular basis. And when people make comments to me about the blog, it makes me feel appreciated that I'm writing the blog. And that's a big boost to me. But those little communications can be great. What are some other things that they can be doing to try and help those people in the field work on keeping their lives straight, but also being emotionally strong, being mentally strong, and just healthy in that regard?
I would say when folks it's pretty natural and normal that out of sight, out of mind. You go to Tanzania and we think about you every now and again, but it's not like you're regularly a part of dinner table conversation. It's the same. It's just true of everybody. But when we are present, it's very common for someone I show up at a church, or we're there as a family, we're visiting someone. It could even be a private meeting with someone, and they say, well, tell me how things are going in Germany or how things are going in Spain. And I get about a sentence and a half out, and they just go away. Now, I think I could step on toes here. So are you okay with controversial? I think that could be a uniquely American problem. We have short attention spans, or Western problem.
I would go with developed world problem more than America may be at the upper end of that level, and I agree with that. But I definitely think that there's a developed world of too many things going on in their lives, whereas in the less developed worlds, they have more time to focus. There's a great book. I think it's I can't remember which one it was, maybe Servant Leadership or something along those lines, talks about the difference between different cultures and those that are time-based and those that are not. In other words, those that see time as money or time as a precious resource, as opposed to those cultures that don't see time as anything other than it's just there. It's not anything I have to worry about. And those, the differences in those cultures are pretty drastic, especially in how they pay attention.
Yeah, and that's it. So learning to pay attention and then ask the second and third follow-up question. So, I actually I did some training for high school students graduating overseas in an international school environment, going back to the United States. And so they've got quite an exotic life. They grew up overseas, they've traveled a bunch, and that can be intimidating when you go, they show up at Clemson to be a freshman, and they're standing in line waiting to get books, and someone says, "Where are you from?" Complicated question for a third culture kid, but we encourage them to have a one sentence answer. I grew up overseas. Period.
Mm-hmm.
Don't start the longer answer, because if they're curious, they'll go, "Oh, really?
Where?
Well, where did you grow up?" And you can give them the 3-sentence answer. I went to an international boarding school in Germany. It was really cool. I enjoyed it a lot. Period. Really? Would you tell me about that? Now you've got someone that really is interested. And I think the same can be true in the fellowship hall of a church. Hey, tell me how things are going in Germany. Well, they're going well. Period. And if you really want to know, you go, well, what's going well? Or like if you say, what's going well and what are you struggling with? Like, I'd love to tell you what I'm struggling with, because even your asking gives me permission to struggle. Mm-hmm. It doesn't elevate me to some, extra holy sainthood just because I happen to be doing my kingdom work in another culture. So that's always the first thing that comes to mind is learn the mental discipline of focus, and then ask the second and third question to show you're really interested.
So genuine conversation, genuine and honest conversation is vital when they're there in person, but not just when they're in person. Even as hard as it is via emails and Zoom calls and all that kind of stuff, trying to do the exact same things. Don't just, accept that first answer sometimes. Give them that chance to express themselves openly.
Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah. Anything else you can advise for helping to maintain emotional and mental health?
On the mission field, it's most people that make the choice to serve overseas in a missions environment are people that I characterize by I know, I go, I do. That's sort of the 3 values. I know what I believe. I know my own story, and I've been impacted by the living God. I go somewhere that's uncomfortable. I go and I want to take the kingdom into a place other than the place where I am most comfortable, what I call home. And then the I do, I make a difference. When you get I know, I go, I do people launched into some of the tense cultural environments and the challenges that come with the mission field, I think sometimes it starts to reveal problems in how they define knowing. So when a Christian says I know, there's several ways to know. I can know the answer to a math problem, my engineer friend. I can know the load bearing capacity of a wall. Those are all ways I can have mastery over certain areas of knowledge. And it's easy to think about my relationship with God in that context of mastery. What do I know about God? But knowing is also a relationship word. It has nothing to do with mastery and mental capacity. It's a man knows his wife in sexual intimacy. That's a euphemism for deep, intimate connection. We know God. And sometimes I think when folks get out to the mission field, they recognize they know a lot about God. They've been trained. They've gone to seminary. They can talk about their hermeneutics and their theology. But it exposes that maybe the relational knowing was not as substantial or attended to as some of the factual knowing. And factual knowing will not sustain you on the mission field. What happens is that your identity gets shifted to the going and doing. So knowing is supposed to be where my identity is rooted. My identity is rooted in that I'm a son of the living God. He says, you're my beloved son. I am well pleased with you. That's where my identity is rooted. That's the relational knowing. If my identity is what I know about God, well, at some point that crumbles and my identity shifts into the going and doing. And now going and doing were never meant to carry the weight of an identity. If you're doing, remember all the cultural stuff that makes my doing kind of have lots of hiccups and false starts, and I don't get as much done as I typically would in my home culture. Well, now my doing is not substantial enough for my identity. And I've gone, and when I went, I expected to change the world. There's a little bit of a Messiah complex in most missionaries, and it gets exposed because they're not having the impact they wish they were having. And now their identity is kind of crumbling. Go ahead. Thought?
I feel blessed in that regard. When I first started thinking about this, a couple of people set me down who had been in mission fields and said, don't think of it as you know God well enough that you're supposed to go there and tell them how to be Christians. That you have to understand they know about God or they know about certain things, and they're going to bring that into the fold of what you have, and you may learn stuff from them, and you need to be willing to accept and do that. And from the experience of my military background, I long understood that people in other cultures are sometimes more right than I am. And that was a hard concept for me in the military to learn, but as I brought that into the mission field, it has helped me a lot of times, especially building buildings. We don't build them the way we do in the US. Their way is good for what they have available as far as resources, and I have to adapt to what they're bringing to the table. And the same is true of my Christianity. I understand my story, but now my story gets enlarged by encompassing their story, by encompassing the things that they see. I don't compromise as far as the actual belief structure, but I understand better sometimes where they come from. One of the big discussions we have over here is forgiveness versus trust, because most people here think that if they do something wrong to you, you will forgive them and then they can go right back and do things again. Has a lot to do with the corruption atmosphere in a lot of countries. And I in my previous site, I ran into this a lot, in the fact that like the guy who used to work on my truck, he would constantly try and take advantage of me, thinking I didn't know enough about a truck to be able to, I just was letting him work on it. And so after a point, I said, okay, I'm sorry. I can't let you work on the truck anymore. And he says, no, you're a Christian. You must forgive me. I'm going like, I have forgiven you, but I don't always trust you. And that's a big difference to me. And that was a discussion he didn't understand at the time.
Mm.
And so we had to have a long discussion. Eventually we did rebuild trust, and I did let him work on the truck again. But, you know, I was able to influence a little bit there with my understanding, but I also have to be willing to accept what they bring to me to understand where they're coming from. Much like when you talked about earlier about the people who go into a culture and become like the people in the culture. I
Yeah.
recognize I can't become everything like the people I'm working with, that, you know, their experiences in life are just too different from mine, but I can try and show that I'm willing to try to do things their way. For example, I have not had a car at the site I'm at. I do local transportation just the way they do. They're all shocked by this. They all expect me to go buy a car and just drive wherever I want to go. It totally blows their mind. That I will walk places, that I will get on the back of a motorcycle taxi, that I will get in that van with 30 other people and drive an hour and 45 minutes in the heat to get somewhere. You know, that's just something they don't think of us doing from our culture. So it's important when you go over there to adopt some of their ways. Don't compromise too much, but, you know, adjust and let them see you as one of them. And the same is true of your Christianity. You have to be willing to open up sometimes, I think, and accept a different cultural understanding of the same beliefs.
Yes, so agree.
All right. Anything else you'd like to add? I think we're getting close to the end here.
Great to be with you.
Yeah.
I look forward to you getting back to Tanzania.
Me too. I am
so
so ready to be back.
Passport comes in soon, and you can launch and be truly by Kilimanjaro rather than just faking us all out.
Yeah. This is, for those who don't know, this is actually a picture I took at my school. I forget which way I have to lean so you can see it. So that's Kilimanjaro, about 60 miles away from our school. So occasionally when the clouds are down, I get to see it clearly, and I love it, especially when I'm out walking. But I hope to be back there soon, and thank you for that. All right. I guess that's the end of today's podcast. And again, I thank Jeff for joining me and sharing his views. And in a nutshell, you know, treat your missionaries that you're supporting and loving as, you know, real people, and understand they're struggling with a lot of the same things you're struggling with, but often in a different cultural context to add additional strength. And just love them. Love them, love them, love them.
Right on.
Thank you again. And that's it for today.
Thanks for having me.